Hey everyone, welcome to Cerwin Vegas, and in this video I'm going to be working on a set of AT-12s out of the AT-12 series cabinets. I'm going to be doing new foam and new spiders. If you haven't watched my previous video, I did showing the condition of the spiders of these woofers I was going to refoam them. Upon pulling apart the foam, even before, I noticed something was a little different with them, and it happened to be that the spiders on them were worn right out. In this video, I'm going to be disassembling these woofers, removing the old spider, and installing a new spider with new foam and putting everything back together. The previous video I put out, and all that was on was how to identify that your spiders are worn out. I will leave a link in the description to that video if you want to check it out. But that's enough talking for now. Let's get to fixing those woofers. So the first thing I started doing was I wanted to see if I could remove the spiders from the basket and everything here without damaging anything. You don't have to do this. These spiders are worn out. There was no point in me trying to save it. It was just seeing if I could do it. I've never actually done just a spider replacement job on a set of woofers before. Usually it's just a full recomb. So here I was, that's really all I was doing here, was just seeing if I could remove it without wrecking it. But it worked out not too bad with some lacquer thinner I used on it and getting the heat gun on it, but I was able to pull it out without damaging it too much, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. Okay, so now you get to soldering. All I was doing was heating up the solder that was on the terminals while putting pressure on it with the pliers there, just trying to pull the leads out of the terminal so I could free everything up from the basket. So once the spider is removed and the leads are removed from the terminal, you can just lift the basket up, and I was able to save the original cone. Now the next thing I do here is, first thing you got to do is cover up that voice coil gap in the magnet so no debris or anything gets in there while you're working on them. Okay, so now I want to clean up the basket where the spider was glued to it. I like to use a lacquer thinner, especially on the baskets. Does a really nice job, loosens the glue up, and makes it really easy to scrape off. So here's the part that I wasn't really 100% sure about how I was going to do this. Obviously I have to remove the spider from the woofer, but the epoxy that they use to glue that is it's very hard and pretty difficult to remove. So I just cut it out as close as I could to the former, being very careful not to wreck anything else. And then after I had it off, I just tried to shave as much off as I could up to that epoxy. It'd be pretty tough to actually cut all that epoxy right off, so I just tried to trim as much as possible. It worked out not too bad. So now that everything was pulled apart, this was actually the other one I was working on. I didn't actually capture the video of me pulling the dust cap off that other one, but I did get this one. This is a tedious job to do it without wrecking anything. You really need to take your time. Obviously the dust cap needs to come off because when everything's going back in with the new spiders, everything has to be shimmed. So you need to have access to that voice coil gap once the cone is installed into the basket. So I usually like to use a little bit of lacquer thinner. I try not to get it everywhere, and I try not to use too much. I just apply it with a brush very lightly after I've heated it up. The heat helps soften that glue up, and then you get the lacquer thinner on. I feel it absorbs in there a little better, and then I warm it up again with the heat gun, being really careful not to get it too hot. And I like to use a pick, and very slowly, little bit at a time, just start making my way around the point where the dust cap contacts the cone where it's glued there. And if you're really, really careful and patient, this isn't really that bad to do, but you do have to be very careful not to damage the cone or the dust cap in the process. Now, I'm working my way around. Eventually you come to a spot where it's the glue is still hard and it hasn't let go yet. You just have to get the heat gun out again and warm it up little bit by little bit, and eventually you'll make your way all around, and the dust cap will pop right off. Okay, so now we've got the cone out, and it's time for the new spiders. So when the new spiders come, you got to keep in mind, now when we cut the old spider off, there's it's pretty hard to get the epoxy that they use to glue the spider to the former. So it is gonna be a little thicker right where the spider needs to go. So what I do is I trim the inside of the new spider. Basically what I'm doing when I do that is I'm just taking the lip off. If I have my other one here. So basically what I'm doing is, you can see this lip. Where's my... You see this lip right here. I'm basically cutting just inside of here to take this little lip off, because that's the part on here it's still epoxy onto there. So with the spider, with the lip still on here, it's not going to fit. It's not going to fit around here properly, and it's either going to be sitting too high or too low. And you want to make sure you keep the same height that it sits in that magnet, because that's just the way they were designed. So basically all I do is I just take a knife. I've even used like tin snips, even anything that you can be accurate with. And so when I'm done, it looks like this. I know it's not perfectly round, but I'm not, if you look, it's not cut too much on the other side. You got to be careful not to cut too much of this away. You just want to take that little lip off. Just got to take this off. So when you go to put this onto the former, it's got to slide over the voice coil, which is going to be thicker because you got your windings on there. And it's basically got to sit right up beside it, so if you can see, it matches up almost perfectly. And it may not be 100%, but I mean, it's gonna, the idea is to get it as close as possible, and it's still gonna work good. It's not gonna change nothing. So yeah, and then you just got to make sure when it's down and sitting that the spider is sitting properly. But that I'm not going to worry too much about, because when we get the voice coil shimmed into the magnet, it's going to be 100% straight in there, and then that's when we're going to glue the spider to the former while everything's in the basket and shimmed. And then once that's dry, then I'll pull the cone and voice coil. I'll pull everything out of the basket again. Basically just to get some glue. We'll put some more epoxy around, or whatever you want to use for glue. You can, there's a few options. I'm going to put it actually onto the spider first, and then I'm going to set everything back in to the basket and have the shim in there as well before this actually gets pressed all the way down to the basket. And you got some time for that glue before it sets, but you just want to make sure that the coil is shimmed before. It's got to be shimmed while you're gluing anything, because you got to make sure it's going to be perfectly straight. So first things first, pull. You got to make sure your tinsel leads here, these have to be lined up with the terminals on the basket. I mean, it's not super important now, because right now all we're doing is gluing the spider to the former, but before everything gets installed. So also too, you're going to check for your height, so always make note before you pull this out roughly where it's sitting. Now, it was kind of difficult with these because they were so worn out. It wouldn't sit properly, but I mean, I know the proper height where they sit. And if you're unsure, you can always take your new foam, set it on there, and then just make sure it's at the right height. Now when you're pushing these in, now that you want to shim it so it's going to hold it. You want it to be fairly stiff. You don't want to be too tight where you really got to push on it. You just want it, it's got to be snug. So if you lift it up, it stays up. You push it down, it stays down. So I found the brown shim on these AT-12s are probably the perfect shim for it. So now I'm going to push down just till it mates up with it. So I'm going to kind of give it a little spin too, just make sure. So this is the part that kind of sucks a little bit when you're doing just a spider replacement. It's a little harder to get the epoxy in there, just a little tight in the basket. Normally when doing a recone kit, you would do this before the cone gets set on top, but because it's just a replacement, I had to try to squeeze it in there, so it wasn't the greatest, cleanest job I've ever done, but it did the trick. So once I let that epoxy set, didn't take too long, I pulled everything out again and then start applying the glue to the spider and then get that put back into place with the shims. So once I let that sit and let the glue dry, turn the woofer upside down and just going to reinstall the lead wires back to the terminals. So what I had to do here was I had to warm the solder up a little bit to be able to fit the lead wires back through the holes. It was a little tricky, but it wasn't too bad. You could probably take a drill bit and drill out that solder if you wanted to, or a solder sucker works. That's what I had used, and it didn't take all of it quite out enough to fit those wires through. So I was eventually able to get it done. And then of course, once that was the wires were through, I was just adding a little more solder to it to make sure It's a good connection. It's not going to come apart on you. So once the cone's back in place, spider's glued, and the lead wires, everything was hooked back up, it's time to install the new foam. So once I have the new foam surround glued to the cone, I like to use, it's a different glue than what I use to glue it to the cone that I use to glue the foam to the basket. It's pretty much the same stuff. It dries flexible and clear. It takes a little longer for it to set up, which sometimes is kind of nice to have that option. It gives you some time to make sure you got everything set straight and that everything's lined up properly. Because I was shimming this while I was doing it, I probably didn't need to use that, but yeah, it does take a lot longer for that glue to start setting up. So once that glue starts setting up and starting to stick to the basket, and I know I got it glued and straight and right where I want it, I like to take the gasket or the beauty ring, whatever you want to call it, and just and set it on top of where the glue, the foam is on the basket, and then I just flip it upside down, let the weight of the speaker hold that foam up against the basket while the glue sets up 100%. Once the glue is set, it's time to remove the shim and check for any coil rub. Well, everything checked out good. There was no coil rub. What I like to do with these gaskets, these plastic ones anyways, I cut most of it off I can with a knife, and then I just take some sandpaper or sanding block and I just kind of sand it down. Just make sure that the edge is nice and flush, so when you glue it back on to the basket, that you're not going to have any uneven areas or have it sticking up higher on one end than the other. So now here I'm just taking a screwdriver, kind of poking through the foam and just making sure that that gasket, the holes in the gasket are lined up perfectly with the basket. Okay, so now we're going to get the dust cap put on. I always like to do this last. I like to have the woofer mounted into the cabinet. It is much easier to make sure that it is going to go on straight. So these AT series are probably some of the best ones for doing it, putting dust caps on, because they have the ridged cone. Because we already pulled these off before and it's still the original cone, I know exactly where it's going to sit. So instead of having to apply glue to the dust cap and landing it in perfect spot when I'm putting it on, I can actually apply the glue to the cone and then drop it into place, and that it's a lot easier not to get glue everywhere on the cone and make it visible. These are probably my favorite ones to put dust caps on because they are the easiest. Like so, and like I've got this one done already. I always like to have something with some weight to sit on it for it to dry. Get it in there. Just make sure it's in there nice. There we go.